in really the simple question, though very complicated, simple but fundamental, of how it is that individuals manage to live together as a political society. So how it is that billions of people manage to live together on Earth, but in different political societies here. Inevitably, that topic engages the built realm, whether civic, public, or private spaces. As political theorist Susan Bickford puts it, buildings and public space shape the citizen's sense of what people, perspectives, and problems are present in the democratic public. Particular forms of intersubjective relations are propagated by contemporary practices of city building that materialize particular versions of home and of the public. But in today's political realm, dominated by 21-hour filibusters citing green eggs and ham, or fiscal woes that seem utterly insurmountable, it's hard to feel like one can be at all effective in shaping the civic realm or even playing the role of a citizen. The term citizen has been co-opted and devalued. More often than not, it stands in today for responsibility, either for the planet, global citizen, or for the local, citizen of the common good. Arguably, the architect's role has been pushed towards that of responsible service provider, responsible for servicing ecological regulations, zoning regulations, neighborhood regulations, etc. Already now, more than 25 years ago, Kenzo Tange summed up this trend with his condemnation that architects today tend to depreciate themselves, to regard themselves as no more than just ordinary citizens without the power to reform the future. That really just takes the wind out of your sails. As architects, we're regulated by policies. As citizens, we form politics. While that might be an oversimplification, these two roles embody the greater complications that underlie architecture's social contract. This semester's Cullinan series focuses squarely on this challenge, putting forth models about how one might foster innovative practices as citizen architects. My hope is that you recognize that any one of your projects engages the very questions that are at the root of citizenship. These forms of intersubjective relations, as Bickford put it, that exist in any project, whether housing in the Fifth Ward, whether Houston City Hall, or any design that you're producing right now. Reinhold Martin was one of the first people who came to mind when I was trying to compose the roster for this Cullinan series. I've long admired him for his engagement with politics and his commitment to architecture and urbanism. Through his writings, his teaching, and his practice, these two threads, architecture and politics, have challenged one another, not to resolve themselves easily or seamlessly, but to push hard to improve both ends. Martin has published several books, including The Organization Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism Again. Those are two titles. Sounds like 15 books. And then Multinational City, Architectural Itineraries. Currently, he's working on two books, A History of the 19th Century American University as a Media Complex, and A Study of the Contemporary City at the Intersection of Aesthetics and Politics. Reinhold is Associate Professor of Architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, where he directs a PhD program in architecture, and also the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. Under Reinhold, the Buell Center, which has overlapping constituencies, including academics, professionals, and the general public, has recently pursued initiatives that explore architecture's participation in the public sphere. These can be characterized as a sustained effort to help catalyze a new national conversation about issues of general concern, such as public housing. In 2012, as director of the Buell, Martin co-curated with Barry Bergdahl Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream at MoMA, for which he and Bergdahl also co-edited the exhibition catalog. But I have to say one last thing, which is that I actually don't remember when Reinhold and I first met, but I remember very early on being at a conference when I was still a PhD student and he had already graduated into the realm of teaching. And during this conference, it was mainly student papers that were being produced and talked about. At one point, Reinhold very assertively and very sort of succinctly, just sort of in a slightly exacerbated tone, said, "What's at stake?" And I have to say that that moment, I think, is sort of, or that phrase is a refrain in his work, as sort of a work that always looks at what's at stake, what sort of determines what's urgent about what we're doing today. I think we saw that earlier in the Brocken talk, and I think we'll see that again in this lecture. Thank you for coming.
Okay, I'll turn this on. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. You know, I do say that a lot, don't I? She caught it. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for a wonderful introduction. And I have to say, I already thank Sarah privately, but I want to do so publicly for coming up with this format, which I can already tell is going to be fun. And I invite you really into the conversation as soon as possible. It's a fantastic way to visit colleagues and friends, in a sense, with something on the table, as I'll try to elaborate. And it is also such a pleasure to see so many colleagues and old friends around, and others who one has encountered in various ways. I'll try not to detain you for too long. This should be under an hour, but I'm going to present a lecture of sorts that's written down here. But before I do that, I just wanted to say, first of all, we were talking about some of this over coffee, and it's, on one level, I hope that this is just perceived as as a continuation of that discussion and of other discussions certainly that we've had over the years, and that's another, opportunity for which I have to thank Sarah, is the opportunity to discuss these issues in various contexts, and now, here. But also, I think in a language, I hope, that will try to translate between the different realms and spheres in which architects, students of architecture, and scholars communicate. So, in other words, this is and isn't a theory talk. There will be a little bit of something that might be recognizable to some of you as theory. Here, that's not an apology, that's an assertion. But at the same time, I hope that it will be clear that in a way, amongst the efforts in some of the work that I've been doing that I'll describe, it has to do with this kind of translation, which is a discursive activity. Right? So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, okay. So I would like to speak with you this evening about a forgotten subject, the subject of housing. Forgotten not just in the sense that modernist achievements, for example, in the design of mass housing, were largely eclipsed, and I have to thank Stephen Fox because we had a great tour just before in the afternoon, and we drove by a public housing named, I forget now the name of this place, I should remember, that was hope-fixed almost out of existence, an important public housing complex that was demolished and replaced with what is called affordable housing. So that whole story is partly what I'm talking about. These efforts of modernism to eclipse some 50 years ago or so, gradually over this period, by a postmodern turn that effectively rewrote the history of the 20th century. But also in the sense, forgotten in the sense of a more recent, more widespread act of forgetting, what the worldwide financial crisis of 2007-2008 so obviously put on the table, namely the housing question. As you may remember, the effects of the near collapse of international financial markets centered on mortgage-backed securities were particularly acute in the American suburbs, although it can be argued that they were more severe and in fact longer lasting in Southern Europe and in a different way across the global South. So it's not just like an American thing, by any means. But I'm not here to speak with you merely about the destructiveness of finance capitalism. That much should be self-evident, and if it is not, we can talk about it later. Instead, I'm here to speak with you about architecture, urbanism, and citizenship, my assignment. Or at least that's the pretext, but you're going to have to be patient, since I'm afraid I do not have any new architectural paradigms to tell you about. Again, we can talk if you'd like. Instead, I want to consider something more enduring, namely a type of thought with scientific aims. And when I say scientific, I mean it, since I'm speaking about a type of thought that seeks truth, small t, contested truth, contestable and contested truth, knowledge. But if this thought constitutes a science, it's an unorthodox one, which I'll call a science of the imaginary. Its postulates are as follows. These are sort of the three main propositions. One, what we call politics is defined at any given moment by a sort of imaginary fence, inside of which are contained all the propositions that are thinkable, and outside of which lie others, which a particular historical situation has defined as unthinkable. Two, although the fence dividing thinkability and unthinkability is imaginary, its effects are real. Erected in the realm of aesthetics, it both derives from, and I mean aesthetics very broadly, it both derives from and frames the facts on the ground, material conditions that allegedly constitute a common sense reality in which thought is anchored. We were talking about this over coffee a little bit. Three, the fence cannot be permanently torn down, but it can be moved. So, well, another more traditional way of describing this is in terms of what is considered to be on or off the political table, you know, the metaphor of what's on the table at any given time. Here we might list particular, so for example, single-payer healthcare was not on the table in the healthcare. It was pushed off the table right away. It's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Here we might list particular proposals or their associated doctrines and assign to each a relative influence or lack thereof. Or we might make an inventory of who is and who is not at the table. This is a very common practice in architecture, and perhaps lament how infrequently architects are invited to meetings around tables that count. They feel marginalized. But as with the layout of the fence, for the time being, I'm less interested in these procedures than I am in the design of the table itself. So there's an architectural question. To explain, just please, if you will, allow me to digress for a moment into some of the historical and philosophical origins, and this is very, again, this is just a sketch of the particular notion of citizenship and of the citizen that I take to be the rubric, and I think Sarah's comments have helped me transition into this, the rubric under which this lecture series is organized. And by the way, I also very much appreciated having a rubric, having a theme, and you know, with an actual kind of text behind it to respond to. Among other things, the citizen is a partial product of Western rationalism. It's not the only thing, but it's one of them. We may think we know what that means, i.e. that citizenship is defined by the responsible exercise of reason in civic matters, for example, which is a model inherited from the European Enlightenment. However, if we go to the source, so to speak, in a brief but important essay from 1784 titled An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant distinguished between two forms, the private and the public, in which reason was to be exercised differently. And this is a little bit counterintuitive. It's sort of famously counterintuitive. Now, by private, Kant does not mean anything like domestic, really, whether in the sense of the private household or the sense of the interior life of humans. By placing restrictions on the private use of reason, he means, and on the kind of things you can debate privately, he means instead to limit the use of reason or independent critical thought when it comes to one's productive or economic function, in one's job, we could say. In this private role, according to Kant, the enlightened, reasonable, and above all critical subject is ultimately constrained to obey or to follow the rules in order not to disrupt the orderly functioning of society. And Kant, after all, was not exactly a revolutionary. Those whom today we would call public servants, such as state bureaucrats or policymakers or whatever, were and remain therefore limited to this private use of reason, according to the maxim promulgated by the quote-unquote enlightened monarch Frederick the Great, who is referenced in Kant's text, the maxim, argue but obey. You can argue, but you have to obey. Whereas in contrast, in what Kant calls the public arena, reasonable argumentation and critical reflection are granted more or less unrestricted freedom, or at least in principle. Again, by public, Kant does not necessarily mean outside, as in, say, a city square or in front of a public building. For though these are potential sites in which political or social critique might occur, the civic injunction to obey might also apply above all in spaces like these. And we see this all the time. No, what Kant means by public is what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas would much later call the public sphere, Habermas and many others, meaning the entire communicative arena, or as Habermas put it in 1964, quote, a realm of our social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed, end quote. So in Kant's early formulation, this sphere comprised what we would today, and was also then called, in those days called a reading public, gathered around newspapers and journals. The community that was produced, this was later then called imagined community, around newspapers, for example, debating the news of the day. Today we can add to these interactive readers many others. Television viewers, and of course there are degrees of interactivity and passivity associated with this. Television viewers, radio listeners, movie theater and museum goers, that's where we're headed. Web surfers and even Twitter followers and Facebook friends, if I can dare say that. Facebook, I mean, can you imagine they turned the word friend into a verb? How could they? I still can't. Anyway, for Kant, then the critical public use of reason was something a citizen was only really able to do in his, and specifically for this gendered concept, not her, free time. It's a gendered notion of critique. Sitting, say, in a Berlin coffee shop discussing the news of the day, where he was not obliged by virtue of his job to recognize and obey the powers that he served in his productive life, or more specifically, if he had a particular kind of job. So, in that sense, for Kant, the only figure able and indeed obliged fully to exercise these critical faculties while doing his job was the scholar, or what we would call today the intellectual. In Kant's day, intellectuals were philosophers, theologians, clergy, scientists, poets, editors, publishers, and others trafficking in the relatively free and critical exchange of ideas. Today, such important, difficult concepts, and they are difficult, as academic freedom owe their existence partly to this heritage. But although I'm addressing you in an academic environment, and I go by the name of scholar, we must remember that this is also a professional school. It's therefore, and there's a whole other branch of Kant's thought that is very, very interesting in this regard. To that extent, we in professional schools are alive with theology faculty, which is something to think about. But anyway, today, in that sense, as a professional school, any professional school, including the one that I teach in, it's a site where, however enlightened the setting, and certainly we are in an enlightened setting, whether we are speaking about law schools, medical schools, architecture schools, or which was Kant's principal target, theology faculties, academic freedom is typically more constrained. Not overtly. For the simple reason that, whether you like it or not, you are being trained to do a job, in however critical a manner. And therefore, following Kant, you may argue in the university, we can argue here, about the values or assumptions guiding that job. But out there in the office, in your quote-unquote private function as professional architects, amidst the world of clients and laws and budgets and contracts, you are constrained largely to obey. Okay, but still we're not there yet, or maybe when you go to studio you're sort of there, I don't know, you can compare notes there. But actually, yes and no. Because despite the relatively public character of the cloistered university, see this is the somewhat counterintuitive aspect of this, as a site of free, unconstrained discourse, this obedience tends to work its way back into architecture schools in the form of common sense advice, like to be realistic, for example, or to learn to work within the system, and so on. So those are kind of gentle ways of inculcating effectively obedience. So we might therefore be tempted to ask, To what degree then is the architect, I'm sure you're asking, to what degree then is the architect able to operate as a critical intellectual, if at all, wherever? This is undoubtedly an important question, but for our purposes it's not quite the right one. Instead, I suggest that we ask, to what extent is the architect or the architectural scholar able to operate as a specific intellectual? Now, I'm, again, here another move, borrowing this term, the specific intellectual, from the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, who, in an interview in 1977, proposed redefining the intellectual not as a custodian of universal reason in the Kantian sense, but instead as a sort of strategist who deploys expert critical knowledge at carefully chosen points in the world system, precisely by virtue of his or her worldly involvement. And the kind of worldly involvement is the key element. Oddly enough, Foucault's example, and this could be a little counterintuitive, Foucault's example of a specific intellectual, which also, by the way, refuses in large degree the public-private opposition, was the dissident nuclear physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. As you may know, Oppenheimer was the so-called father of the atomic bomb, who, after the Second World War, used his expertise vigorously and at great personal cost to oppose the further development and deployment of nuclear weapons. Foucault's larger point, whether you kind of buy the Oppenheimer example or not, his larger point was that technical expertise can be wielded like a knife to make a precise intervention that, because the underlying issue can be generalized, that's important, it can be generalized, it's not just a technical point, still participates in what he called the discourse of the universal, which we can understand as a secular, non-transcendental version of Kantian universal reason. But it can be generalized only by speaking from a localized, relative, and worldly position around a particular issue, basically. Well, the housing question is one such generalizable issue. Were it to be taken up seriously by intellectuals and architects expert in tracing its many ramifications and its connections to other worldly yet quote-unquote universal processes like financialization and gender violence, the housing question could be, metaphorically speaking, as explosive as Oppenheimer's bomb in connecting technical knowledge with general concerns. Along with a few others, architects and architectural scholars are uniquely positioned to pose such a question scientifically, not so much as citizens, but rather as highly trained specific intellectuals. Posed correctly, the housing question reveals processes that define our epoch, such as, for example, the state's relationship with markets, if we can even differentiate between those two realms, the structural interests of transnational corporations and financial organizations and institutions, the infrastructural role of aesthetics, and the potential for strategic counter-movements within and against the global neoliberal juggernaut. All of those, and many others, are condensed in the housing question. We might begin doing so, posing this question scientifically, then, with a recap, just a quick recap of what you already know, of some pertinent non-architectural information. As you know, the U.S. housing market is almost entirely credit-based. Buying a house usually entails putting down a relatively small down payment and covering the rest with a long-term mortgage loan from a bank. I'll put a parenthesis here. Actually, I recently gave a version of this talk in Mumbai to an audience quite expert in housing issues, and much of the discussion had to do with the comparison of a cash-based system versus credit-based, because they know it's coming, basically. Anyway, buying a house usually entails putting down, I just said that, putting a down payment, long-term mortgage, etc. Since 2007, during a period of high unemployment and economic hardship, millions of people have been unable to pay monthly home mortgage bills and thus have defaulted on their loans. As a result, they've gone into foreclosure and have been evicted by the financial institutions that own the mortgage loan. Once a loan goes into foreclosure, these institutions are legally empowered to seize the property, evict the tenants, who are referred to misleadingly as homeowners, since the bank actually owns the home, as they discovered, and resell it in order to recoup. The bank resells it in order to recoup as much as the original investment as possible. You know this. As you also know, the American home mortgage crisis of 2007 and 2008, which was centered in this country's sprawling suburbs, was an important factor in the worldwide financial crisis that followed, largely because millions of high-risk or so-called quote-unquote subprime mortgages had been bundled by the banks and sold to international investors, who subsequently lost their investments as the mortgages went into default. So the process of foreclosure was not limited to small-town banks and their individual clients. It was, as the saying goes, global. This means, for example, that investors, whether they were private individuals, state institutions, or banks, and whether they were located in China, India, Brazil, or the US, or anywhere else, the investors ultimately performed the evictions. The instruments they used, such as the bundled subprime mortgages, passed through many levels of abstraction, many algorithms, and many trades, such that these investors were often quite surprised to discover that they actually held a stake in somebody else's house. Eventually, in the United States, many investors and the financial institutions servicing them, unlike the so-called homeowners who were evicted, were bailed out with government funds. That again, you know. Nor was the cascade of mortgage foreclosures, evictions, and bailouts limited to the United States. It rippled through southern Europe, where widespread unemployment and bank repossessions or foreclosures left the Portuguese, Spanish, and Greek housing markets in shambles, also the Irish and their various other effects. And of course, the related financial crisis had and continues to have worldwide repercussions. Nevertheless, while the historically middle-class American suburbs have seen ever-increasing levels of poverty and dispossession, the 2010 census is very interesting in this regard, and where conflicts including racial and class conflict, to say nothing of the feminization of poverty, these kinds of conflicts that are usually associated with large cities are now common in the suburbs. One's ownership of one's house may be at risk, but one's access, for example, to clean drinking water normally is not. It would therefore be inaccurate, in some degree, to compare the precariousness of home ownership among impoverished groups in the American suburbs with the day-to-day precariousness, bare life, and economic and social violence of the so-called global slum, except to say that ultimately, in an interconnected economy, the urban slum in the global south is a precondition for the middle-class suburb half a world away. So they are connected. So, housing insecurity in the American suburbs is one side of a very asymmetrical coin. But what are its specifically architectural characteristics? And don't worry, I'll eventually show you a few pictures, but you'll have to bear with me. I told you. I'm not going to show you what the specific architectural characteristics of this coin are, but I'm going to tell you. In addition to a panoply, you know these things, a panoply of house and housing types, infrastructural systems, settlement patterns, and environmental technologies, the transnational housing system is defined by a variety of overlapping narratives or imaginary scenes. This is why I'm not showing you any pictures. In the United States, the dominant narrative focused on home ownership has acquired the title of, as we know, the American Dream. Although, in fact, there is little that can be described as irreducibly American about this dream, and though its content varies considerably from one account to another, the consensus that we're dealing here with dreams and not realities is surprisingly consistent. I mean, if there's nobody can really tell you what the American dream is, and nobody really cares. The fact is, what's important is that we're dealing with something that can be described as an imaginary construction. This is where architecture comes in, as both a supplier of dream images and perhaps more importantly, as a supplier of the infrastructural space in which these dreams are projected. The fences and tables defining the political economic debate that I mentioned earlier. So I hope you begin to see the connections. Think then about the American dream as a sort of movie, the script for which has been rewritten many times, but which returns consistently to themes such as home ownership, individuality, family, fixed gender roles, and national, ethnic, and racial identity. Architecture supplies the props and the film set, the table, what's on the table. But it also helps to design the production lot and the financing, as well as the movie theater in which the film is shown, the parking lot outside, the kitchen table around which its themes are discussed, the highway along which it recurs as a daydream, and the real and imagined fence around the real and imagined place called America, where all the dreaming is supposedly happening in the first place. So that's the architectural component. These are the material infrastructures that we must study if we are to pursue a science of the imaginary related to housing. But by dream, I do not mean fantasy. Nor do I exactly mean ideology, although that is part of it, even in the complex Marxist sense given to the term by Louis Althusser as, quote, the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. I mean something much closer to public opinion or common sense, constructed in a public sphere, circumscribed by actually existing imaginary fences and gathering around actually existing imaginary tables. We can reliably say that the financial and political aspects of the housing system cannot be imagined without something like an architectural public sphere, or the whole infrastructure of stage sets, production lots, and lighting that supports the movie called The American Dream. That if you don't believe me, do the experiment yourself. Take away all the dreams and all the movie sets, in other words, take away the architecture, and tell me, is there still an economy or a politics there? So you just do the counterfactual. You know, it's not about how to force architecture into politics, just subtract it and tell me what's left. To be more specific, in the case of housing, what we call the reality of political economy is unimaginable without the dreams and movies and the architecture that supports them, even as that architecture too reflects or obeys the laws of political economy. It does what it's told. This means that there are specific points of leverage available for critical intervention. Among these is the one given by the non-economic meaning of the term foreclosed, since questions too can be foreclosed, at least with at least a frequency that is high. They can be foreclosed at least in the sense that they cannot be asked, cannot simply cease to be asked. In other words, questions are not asked any longer, or they're not asked enough frequently enough that, such as to shape the public debate or policy. Right? That's what I'm meaning by the foreclosure of discourse here. People just stop asking certain questions. And as I've already hinted, the housing question has ceased to be asked in a whole series of overlapping public arenas worldwide, and I mean worldwide, not just in the US. In other words, it has been foreclosed in a particular way. And I do mean pretty much everywhere, particularly in the West, and certainly not just in the United States. But more than mere self-censorship, this sense of foreclosure depends on what speech act theorists call performatives, or statements that enact what they say, shaping the conversation in pragmatic ways or erecting the fence in such a way that all available options appear to be on the table, but in fact are not. I especially want you to hear the temporality of the term, foreclosed, closed in advance, and recognize that we're not dealing here with historical inevitabilities, but with preemptive actions. Subtle speech acts that preemptively block or make unthinkable the unfolding of certain thoughts and with them certain possible futures. So repetitions, gentle, subtle repetitions that accumulate into this foreclosure. And in fact, in many public spheres around the world, it's no longer possible to ask a particular question about housing in a particular way. Not because it's historically obsolete, and usually not because it's explicitly forbidden, but because the rules of the game have changed. To be more specific, it's no longer possible to pose the housing question in a way that does not presume the sovereignty or the rule of the financial markets. It's simply not possible in most public spheres to ask that question, to ask the question about housing without, in a sense, evoking or invoking financialization. This is true whether you're a school teacher in New Jersey, a dock worker in Barcelona, or a slum dweller in Mumbai, albeit in dramatically different ways. Needless to say, worldwide financialization is hardly the one and only factor contributing to housing insecurity. Predatory lending, whether in subprime suburban mortgages or in rural microfinance, would not be possible without the willing assistance of national, subnational, or transnational policies and the accompanying political corruption and cynicism. And certainly, the marginalization of the urban, suburban, and rural poor has much to do with long-standing socioeconomic fault lines. However, it's becoming especially difficult. I mean, in other words, much of this predates financialization. However, it's becoming especially difficult, if not impossible, in most national, subnational, or transnational contexts, to discuss housing as a political right belonging to citizens and non-citizens alike, rather than a commodity belonging to consumers. And it's nearly impossible to do so in a democratic fashion without the direct or indirect intervention of financial interests. This is true even if you're speaking about what is often called affordable or low-cost housing, a pair of terms that in English language discourse have successfully replaced earlier terms like public or social housing, and which have their synonyms in other urban policy and economic languages worldwide, and not just, of course, in the housing sector. In all of these, the differences separating affordable or low-cost housing from public or social housing traces the mixed fortunes and contradictions of the socialist or welfare state, and the many attempts during the 20th century to invent societies that are not governed by the banks, that correspond with much of the modern architecture that you've been taught to admire, by the way. Okay, well, needless to say, worldwide, sorry, I did that already, my iPad is not cooperating. Today, along with apologetic words like affordable and low cost that are uttered to cover over the structural inability of both markets and states to provide decent housing for everyone, there's also the ironically heroic figure of the developer. We know that person, right? We may wonder, at least I wonder, why architects still seem flattered when important developers invite them to their important meetings. They talk about this in their lectures, right? Or why they shamelessly brag about it. The developer asked me to do this. But think of this perversity the other way around. What would it take today even to discuss affordable or low-cost housing, housing for persons from whom it ought to be considered obscene to extract further profit? What would it take today to even discuss these things without a developer sitting at the table or standing somewhere in the shadows, if not running the entire show? And we actually did attempt this in Mumbai, and I can tell you interesting stories. For in the end, the housing question is a question of sovereignty, which does not mean that it's only a question of institutional governance, of who makes the rules, backed by whatever combination of wealth and power is operative at the time. The housing question also entails a quasi-theological sovereignty of the mind, a way of thinking that establishes rules about what concepts, what principles, and what assumptions are admissible before any practical questions are asked in the first place, quote-unquote practical questions. This is not to say that contemporary debates about housing, the extant debates, of course there are quite a few, it's not to say that these don't challenge a priori rules or boundaries or try to rearrange fences and redesign tables. In a way, that's all they do. But my purpose in framing things this way is to open up space for a politics of what can and cannot be imagined, discussed, and debated before the actual discussions begin. Access to this space is what makes housing a universal question. But before elaborating, and maybe to scare you a little bit, I owe a short explanation to the connoisseurs who have recognized in my repeated use of the phrase or term housing question a quotation taken, of course, from Karl Marx's colleague, Friedrich Engels, who published a small book by that name in 1887. Actually, Engels first posed the housing question in a German newspaper in 1872 in response to a follower of the influential French utopian socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who had proposed to limit, this person was writing a newspaper actually anonymously, they proposed to limit the rapid and unsettling urbanization of the German peasantry by defending their property rights, the property rights of peasants in the village from which they were immigrating, to encourage them to stay there. At the time, French and German Proudhonists, whom today we would call liberals or even anarchists sometimes, sought to encourage home ownership in the interest of nurturing a sense of community, or a sense of what they called hearth and home, as a solution to the shortage in worker housing in the rapidly industrializing cities. In contrast, Engels argued that for Europeans circa 1872, the housing question was a false question. Accelerated industrialization, large-scale migration of workers to the cities, and the demolition of existing housing to make way for the new infrastructures had led to housing shortages across Europe. Engels argued, however, that like other housing shortages from other times, this crisis was not based, so it sounds familiar in a sense, right? This crisis was not based on a real shortage of dwellings, but rather on their unequal distribution in favor of the ruling classes. His solution was redistribution through expropriation. For Engels, as for Marx, this was to be accelerated by the proletarianization of the European peasantry, basically coming to the cities, working in factories, and so on, uprooted from hearth and home and drawn to jobs in the urban factories, where they would awaken to class solidarity and hence awaken to the revolutionary project of communism, and so on. That was the proposition. Now, many histories pass through this particular debate, including the history of the suburbanizing America. And actually, there's a very interesting footnote from Karl Marx's daughter, who is in St. Louis, and she writes to Engels about the houses in St. Louis and mortgages and things like that. Anyway, but so it's there, and you know, home ownership and economic security have long been linked. But it's important to note that capitalist development has proved sufficiently dynamic and durable in the past 100-odd years so as to keep one step ahead. That's the whole thing. It's always, you know, ahead of where you think it's going to be. Most recently by separating the mortgage from the physical house and its underlying land. As you know, this is accomplished but with the help of financial instruments that enable the now mobile worker to transfer debt from house to house and from place to place. Unless, as the bankers say, that debt has gone underwater. So it's not so much about anchoring to the hearth and home in the same way. Unless as the debt goes underwater, meaning that more is owed on the house than it's currently worth. This makes the house effectively unsellable and thereby ties the perfectly alienated worker to that particular hearth and home, whether adequate employment is available there or not. Whereas we also know that, on the other side, that in many megacities worldwide, filling up with rural to urban migrants, adequate housing, accompanied by the administrative records that verify one's status, in other words, you have to prove that you live in adequate housing, is a precondition for secure formal employment, thereby closing the vicious circle from the other side. Now, in the United States, the slow and ongoing revolution that we've experienced for the past 30 years is the context within which such struggles play out. And when I say revolution, I mean it, though this one revolves to the right rather than to the left. No aspect of governmental activity illustrates this better than housing. Unlike healthcare, for example, where substantial government programs still partially cushion the blows, the housing sector of the American economy has been essentially privatized for some time. In fact, there's not been a single unit, really, of genuinely public or social housing added in the United States since the early 1990s. In its place is a perennially underfunded set of programs designed to incentivize private developers to build so-called affordable housing through a system of tax credits, vouchers, government grants, and public-private partnerships. Until recently, its flagship piece of legislation, called Hope 6, was designed to replace quote-unquote distressed modernist housing built and run by state and local governments with state-subsidized housing built by private developers, thus expanding the state's role in supporting the real estate markets, because you know, the developers are making a profit off of this, which has been a cornerstone of U.S. housing policy since the New Deal. So it's not new, actually, that's the New Deal was about. The result has been the demolition of and only partial replacement of hundreds of thousands of public housing units nationwide. Now, despite the mortgage foreclosure crisis, then, it's nearly inconceivable today to propose the construction of new, genuinely public housing in the United States. This is what we've tried to do with Wheel Center. And probably in a majority of countries worldwide, for that matter. If such a proposal is not met with ever more ridiculous cries of socialism, as it usually is, it will be condemned as Orwellian social engineering that in any case is more efficiently performed by the private sector. So it's considered Big Brother-ish to think about this. And in a sense, this is true. Aided by state subsidy in virtually every aspect of life, transnational corporate capital has taken over from the state as the principal manager of urban growth, to dramatic effect. But if Engels was correct, this shouldn't matter, since reformist welfare state programs like social housing merely delay the inevitable crisis by placating the working classes, this was effectively the argument, while in the process rescuing capitalism from its own worst consequences. If you read The Housing Question of 1872 next to Engels' Youthful Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, in Manchester in 1844, and you'll understand concretely how he and Marx could have concluded that only full-scale redistribution would suffice. I mean, he was basically, in a sense, the proposition was to let the crisis play out, or only to confront the crisis with a kind of total reorganization. Still, at the very least, the worldwide evisceration of welfare state housing policies and the consequent exacerbation of economic and lifestyle discrepancies might cause us to expect something like an all-out class war. But you have to ask, why hasn't there been a class war? 99%, 1%, all those things, right? But transnational corporate capital and its government employees have evolved new strategies to preempt such eventualities, amongst which actually is liberal activism. So among these, for example, is a willingness, not to say an eagerness, to accommodate certain forms of resistance within the fabric of capitalist expansion itself, which results in a series of double binds that are sometimes obscured by tactical responses to systemic issues. This is, tactical urbanism, for example, I think belongs in this category, largely, not entirely, but partly at least. For example, much architectural or urbanistic activism construes housing as a problem of creative survival under market conditions. Whether we're talking about the slums of Mumbai, the favelas of Brazil, of Sao Paulo, the barriadas around the U.S.-Mexican border, or foreclosed properties in the Atlanta suburbs. In reality, this survival splits unevenly along intersecting lines of race, class, gender, and ethnicity. But in the slums, the suburbs, and the skyscrapers, these divisions appear as social relations, and they're usually described as such. Housing, like healthcare and many other aspects of biopolitical life, has thereby been recast as a social question rather than a political one. So that's why it's called social architecture. So where the political right to housing might begin with a hard-won right to a toilet, architectural responses to the housing question that set their sights on the social block the imaginaries involved. One, by mobilizing them, effectively. One extraordinary mainstream example is the now redundant movement called the Congress for the New Urbanism, which helped to write the American Hope 6 anti-public housing legislation. This is probably the most objectively successful example of kind of architectural activism, and certainly architecture transforming public policy of the last half century. The New Urbanism. So despite the technocratic pretensions of its form-based codes and the pseudo-politics of its community design charrettes, the New Urbanism's neo-traditional planning techniques work primarily at the level of the social imaginary. It's telling, for example, that one building type that is the one building type that's most difficult to imagine in the new urbanist landscape is a factory. When was the last time you saw a new urbanist factory? So that's what Engels had in mind here. While most of the new urbanist or smart codes being adopted in American and now all over the world, Indian, Chinese, Brazilian, etc., municipalities, most of these have provisions for light industry, the entire project is based on cancelling out the figure of the politicized worker and basically of the idea of the working class. This is the first move in a comprehensive exercise that eliminates the residues of political signification from the suburban landscape and replaces these with signifiers of the social. Porches, tree-lined streets, and town squares in which political conflicts are managed in advance through the urbanistic equivalent of psychoactive drug therapy. Here I offer you a lesser-known example, at least lesser-known on these shores. This is a new town outside of Mumbai called Lavasa. It got a big award. It got an award from the CNU and HOK, the Master Planners. It's no accident that architectural form is a central ingredient in this regimen, this psychoactive drug therapy, and specifically the architecture of the house. Aided by such policies as the American Hope 6 public housing demolition program, here's an example, The new urbanists and their fellow travelers have sought to replace images of grim modernist housing projects with cheerful neo-traditional streets. The houses lining these streets are typically designed to suggest ownership through the twin architectural strategies of placemaking and defensible space, whether or not they're actually owned rather than rented in literal economic terms. It's more psychic than economic in this case. The theory behind this, again, is primarily sociological. That ownership, whether literal or symbolic or metaphorical, encourages responsibility and neighborliness. This is the meaning of code words like community, so that circulate through the new urbanist literature and in the mainstream architectural media. However, the community imagined by such practices and conjured in the hazy ensembles of mixed-use neighborhoods, and I do mean imagined community in the sense that I alluded to earlier, is premised on the self-interest of individuals rather than on collective belonging. Necessary as it is in many other ways, the mixed-use critique of modernist or functionalist zoning leaves little ground on which a social class or a minority group can recognize itself as a group, as a collective, as shared conflicts dissolve into a neutral matrix of planned heterogeneity. Despite their brutality, large-scale mass housing projects, you know this one, were also sites in which excluded groups could recognize themselves as groups rather than as mere collections of dispersed and atomized individuals. In that sense, these housing projects in American cities were both silent monuments, and are both silent monuments to the racism of post-war urban renewal and a kind of perverse and inadvertent architecture parlante, or speaking architecture, that made implicit demands that the inequities and injustice to which they bore witness be addressed at the political and economic level. And this is manifest in things like residential organization, residence groups and things like that, who are busy resisting, very, very actively resisting these demolitions, today still. Yes, the housing question is different in Chicago, Nanjing, Mumbai, Dessau, or the suburbs around Atlanta or Houston, and it therefore must ultimately be posed locally. However, the same world system, or really the same system of overlapping and partially coordinated subsystems, such as the housing system, the financial system, and the system of national and transnational sovereignties, passes through these local articulations. Rather than representing a kind of global equivalent, as Engels believed, the housing question registers discrepancies or differences that shape these systems in complementary and sometimes contradictory ways. So it's a somewhat different idea of the system as a homogeneous total phenomenon. Posed correctly, it helps us to grasp the general dynamics of the world system in its specific manifestations. However, given the difficulty of recognizing anything like a commons or a global public sphere that joins these locales, it remains difficult to link up sites as disparate and as asymmetrical as, say, America's suburbs and India's slums. But such links are necessary, and common ground can be summoned around a highly specific set of issues that translate precisely as differences across the range of relevant locales, from Mumbai to Temple Terrace, Florida. Again, this is a matter of changing what is thinkable in the first place, thinkable and sayable in the first place. The fact that it is nearly impossible in the United States to use the term public housing in public in an affirmative manner, try it, not only reflects the insidious intellectual foreclosure I've described, it also reflects the historical failure of the architectural imagination to invent ways to gather a set of publics around itself. Residents, architects, urban planners, politicians, voters, citizens, and non-citizens. Sufficiently robust, set of publics sufficiently robust to reveal that foreclosure for what it is. And that's, of course, the name of the game. Reopening such questions requires coordinated efforts to change the rules of the life or death game of housing. In a world where Athens, Greece, and Athens, Georgia are intimately connected, posing the housing question anew means constructing a set of public spheres, i.e. redesigning the tables and rearranging the fences, to enable citizens and non-citizens alike to reformulate their claim to housing as a constantly renegotiated right, rather than as an economic privilege. An uncertain right. At another scale, such initiatives might even make a renewed claim on the state, any state, as a medium of political contestation, rather than a mere front for multinational capital, cronyism, or racial ethnic divisiveness. This by no means undercuts the possibilities of transnational organization, since given the global nature of the housing system itself, it's inconceivable that any meaningful transformation can be limited to the local or national level. So one has to, this is in a sense the universal aspect. None of this is possible, however, without demonstrating that, contra Engels, there is indeed a housing crisis to begin with. Such a crisis opens onto a layered topography where, as shown negatively by new urbanist aesthetic therapy, actions in the cultural sphere, including the architectural sphere, interlink with actions in the political and economic sphere and vice versa. It's in this spirit, finally, and in a kind of extended conclusion, that I offer you very briefly the example of Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, the 2012 exhibition at MoMA, Sarah mentioned, curated by Barry Bergdahl and myself, that featured hypothetical designs for housing. It was supposed to be public housing, by 5 architect-led teams on suburban sites around the U.S. I'm not going to show you the projects and so on. You can go on the website. The exhibition was framed by the philosophical arguments and research contained in the document known as the Buell hypothesis. There it is. I wrote the hypothesis together with Leah Meisterlin and Anna Kenoff at Columbia's Buell Center. And we wrote this in the form of a screenplay. You can see that it's designed as, how you get the screenplays on the street. You can buy these. That's how they print them. And I should say designed by Glenn Cummings and his colleagues at MTWDF, fantastic graphic designers. It was designed in the form of a screenplay that provides a new script for the imaginary movie called The American Dream. In the script, instead of Marx and Engels, we have the philosophers Socrates and Glaucon, protagonists in Plato's Republic. Now stuck in traffic on Interstate 95, this is the story, this is Socratic dialogue. They're stuck in traffic on Interstate 95 on their way to Athens, Georgia, and reflecting on the catastrophe of suburban sprawl, mortgage foreclosures, and the possibilities of an enlightened public sphere. So the first part of this document takes the form of this Socratic, this kind of slightly satirical Socratic dialogue. It's reproduced in the catalog also for the show. The planning options that are discussed in the Buell hypothesis, which include new forms of public housing, are not radical. It's certainly not radical. In fact, they mirror recent proposals, modeled on the American New Deal, which was an instrument for saving capitalism from its own excesses, not overcoming it. 5 architect-led teams were given this script, along with a series of possible sites, and they developed proposals in summer-long workshops at MoMA's PS1 Annex in Queens. Sean Donovan, President Obama's Secretary of, speaking of citizens, President Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, delivered a keynote address in response to the work. Here he is, you can see him talking with Jeannie Gang about her project, and we're all hanging around. The exhibition was quite controversial, and we at the Buell Center, recorded every word that was written or said about it in print and online, from reviews to blogs to comments to tweets. We recorded every tweet that we can get, to TV, to video. And that was printed as this document called Comments on Foreclosed, and is available online in the website commentsonforeclosed.com. If you search this website, you'll see that the controversy was astonishingly, and we can even say embarrassingly narrow, even provincial. Ultimately, it resembled nothing more than Democrats and Republicans arguing in the United States Congress with the occasional Tea Party slogan thrown in for good measure. I mean, this was all in the kind of comment section on blogs, it was in tweets, it was very interesting nonetheless. The Buell hypothesis also offered a history of public housing. Here's one page. Public housing as a contested object rather than as an idealized solution. In other words, something that has been argued about, that reading publics have been arguing about in the newspapers for the entire century in the American public sphere. Alongside this was a technical analysis of suburbs in crisis across the country, 5 of which eventually became the site of the exhibition projects. Here's one of these are the sites that we looked at initially, and then here, this is a sort of technical diagram of how it had to do with foreclosure rates, but not just that, other indices that produce sort of hotspots in which, if the basic idea is if you were going to spend stimulus money on housing, maybe you might want to spend it in these places. And then foreclosures. This is Rialto, California, and then the house itself. Within these municipalities, we strategically identified. This is also to me, was a very important part of the project. It was somehow slipped off the table. We identified large and small parcels of publicly owned land. This is in Rialto, and this in the middle is an airport. I mean, this is actually quite common around the country that decommissioned airports, for example, are still in public ownership. So the question is, what do you do? Well, most municipalities, because they've been forced to lower taxes so much by the political environment, have been forced to sell these things off to recover operating expenses. But the hypothesis was, well, what if you didn't sell it? What if you actually did something public on it? So in other words, publicly owned land on which something like public or social housing could be built, somewhat insulated from profit-oriented real estate development. So this is the site near the airport in Rialto. But rather seamlessly and without explanation, I must say, all of the teams bypassed this opportunity and proposed to build with private capital on privately owned land. And they all had very, very interesting, I think, and detailed economic and sort of investment proposals. They all had ultimately to do with private capital and privately owned land, albeit in some cases with innovative financing by means of real estate investment trusts, community land trusts, or housing cooperatives. So this is, it says the conventional wisdom of alternatives. And it was good. I mean, I have to say that they were very, very thoughtful about this. I'm not, complaining. Well, while it makes no sense simply to oppose public to private, or to sacralize or to mythologize the state or the public sector, we can see here a hegemonic system of conceptual exclusions kicking in before one word is uttered or one line is drawn. By excluding public housing at the outset, traditional public housing built by municipal authorities outside the markets, by excluding this at the outset, these practical solutions, the eventual projects that we're going to show, practical solutions to practical problems, imaginative as they were, failed to pose the housing question in any systemic sense. Instead, they offered architecturally and financially innovative versions of the status quo. Euphemistically affordable housing and associated amenities that accommodated the markets with taste, subtlety, and by and large, with unapologetic deference to the sovereignty of the real estate developer. How could this be? This is the question I kept asking myself. How could this be? How could these otherwise imaginative, progressive architects and their colleagues, friends, fail to propose something as simple as new forms of public housing? And we were giving them cover. Basically, we were saying, you can blame us. It was kind of like, all right. So, but anyway, I can understand it. But systemically, of course, that's the question. How could this be, right? Even when how could they not do this, not propose something as simple as public housing, even when asked politely and with humor by a pair of harmless Greek philosophers, Socrates and Glaucon, lodged at the core of the Western canon, in a silly movie, in a film script? How, in other words, could they fail to imagine and to house a public outside of the financial markets? Well, just to conclude very briefly, I'll say that it's possible to evaluate this failure, or this apparent failure, in positive terms, as a turning point, a marker. And in effect, this was, in a sense, the intention, at least on my side, on our side, for the entire project. To the understandable annoyance of the participants, and they are annoyed about this, I often refer to this little exhibition as a laboratory experiment. So they were the sort of subjects. It was a test, under highly controlled conditions, to see whether architecture could help redraw the boundaries of the public discourse. The answer was no. To my mind, this result was more revealing and more enlightening than any of the designs themselves, their many innovations notwithstanding. For it revealed quite concretely the imaginary fence that isolates or brackets the housing question. such that even when public housing, paid for with taxes and built by the state, like a public school or a public hospital, not as like a solution to the problem or anything like that, but just like a starting point, just like, well, you know, a possibility outside the sovereignty of developers. When this is placed stubbornly on the table in the potentially disobedient public sphere of the modern museum, you know, with a lot of transgressive art around it and things like this, it slips quietly off, out of bounds, beyond the fence. That's the truth we discover. So it's now time to move the fence and redesign the table. Perhaps you'd like to help. Thank you. Any questions? Counter-proposals? Arguments? Disagreements? Yeah. Sure.
Many questions, but the more one enunciates the term public housing, the more problematic it becomes.
Of course.
Right? And just as you're saying. And because unlike a school, public school, which is a public place, a public housing project is a private place for living in. So there's a kind of this kind of paradox there that the architect, I've said this before in different forms, that has no client in a sense, you know, for that kind of constituency. It's not a public constituency. It's private citizens who need a place to live that is publicly financed in order to, and so it's not public housing. It's private housing publicly realized in a way. And that's actually like being in a fishbowl in some sense too, that you are transparent to the public, which is, you know, horrifying at one level because the public then determines your private life. Well, and so that's the tension of that biopolitical thing.
I actually disagree with the premise, but I can understand why you would say this. I mean, of course, you know, it goes without saying, but one must say it again and again. That none of this represent anything like an advocacy of like the projects or, you know, these kind of basically prison-like sort of warehouses, you know, in which people were forced to live as subjects of a particular system, and generally, you know, with very little choice. And all of the, you know, the ghettoization, that's sort of what I meant by the racism of urban renewal, all these things. I mean, that, you know, is clearly what one must confront when one confronts this issue. But one of actually the main arguments of the dual hypothesis was that all housing is public housing. In other words, that what we call a house is bought and paid for by state policy to a large extent. Of course, the mortgage tax credit is the main instrument through which this happens. But you know, the New Deal infrastructures like highways, the various utilities and so on, all of that makes what you're calling private possible. So I cannot imagine distinguishing between, in this sense, in some ontological sense, between the dwelling as like private and the school or the hospital or you know, the office or any other element type, as it were, in that way, simply because one sleeps there.
Right. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I think that's a very interesting to say. Well, housing is public. I mean, I would say that should be argued with the opposite proposition, which is all property is private. In other words, that there's the only thing that is realized, you know, how private property is realized is public property. You know, it's historical, blah, blah. Sometimes it passes one way, sometimes it passes the other. But the public is actually a fluid gradient of, as is citizenship, right? You come to citizenship fluidly and you retreat, and there are all sorts of modalities and modulation of that. So,
no, of course.
I mean, at least in the Western world, private property is what governs, in a sense, the public. Public property acts like private property.
Right, but that's of course, yes, that's what I meant about the sovereignty of the developer. I mean, basically, but that's not a truth. That's simply an historical development.
Right.
That's not either a philosophical or historical truth. No, that's what I don't. That's what I don't agree. I don't think you start with the idea that public property is automatically participates in all other regimes of property. Where one could start, and this would be interesting, is the oxymoronic idea of public property. In other words, that as it were something like public, and many of the discussions around the so-called commons that have been reactivated today are moving in this general direction, where what we, yes, it's quite true that empirically those state-owned lands are also owned in a way that's very similar to the bank, but the question of sovereignty is fundamental here, and to the extent that in this case the state is a placeholder, really, because by no means either is this some kind of statist, recovery of master planning or something like that in some central office where somebody buys up all the land in eminent domain and like urban renewal, but rather that this really is an invitation to think publicness rather than private as the a priori. To reverse, and this is why Kant is important, to reverse the system of values, and also to refuse the naturalization of the category of property or private ownership as the master signifier under which all other forms of, as it were, sovereignty are to be kind of listed. So that's why but you're completely right. I mean, at a practical level. That's why this cannot possibly idealize, like some people might, the state or anything like that as the vehicle for this. Yeah.
Thanks, Reinhold. Terrific talk. Very, very interesting to ponder. I want to try to sit at your table. So the table, I'm going to conform to your model. I'm going to design the table, and then I'm going to, so to speak, turn it back on you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it's a round table. It's got a lazy Susan in the middle. Yes. On the lazy Susan are right, need, and desire.
Yes.
Around the table are a bunch of chairs labeled banker, mayor, citizen, architect, you name it, around the table. Should I either, which seems one model would suggest to me that we have engaged continually in a struggle to turn the lazy Susan to get whatever we want near us. Yeah. As architects or other parties at the table. The other one is we play musical chairs. I get out of my architect chair and I go over to the mayor chair, or I go over to the banker chair. Are you advocating one or the other or something else?
I think it's probably, if I translate your metaphor, probably something a bit different. The question is really, what's allowed on the table. And this, this is where I am agreeing with Catherine's sort of like point of departure, where concretely old-fashioned public housing is not on the table. Now, whether it ought or ought not to be on the table in this or that particular form, a design, like just imagine design, with particular characteristics that may or may not satisfy various needs, desires, rights, etc., is what needs to be debated. But this is not even possible to debate. I mean, it's completely off the table. And it's not, as I said, a radical proposal. This is not some utopian or revolutionary proposal. This is a New Deal style, very familiar proposal that brings with it very, very complex histories, very, very complex psychodynamics, and particularly when one is dealing with liberal intellectuals who feel badly about what happened. And that's actually where, so that's actually would be the interesting constituents we have around the table. Do it like on the Upper West Side, which is we have tried to do this, or a place like Columbia. It's very interesting because one can test the critique of public housing by forcing it back, as well as the possible invention of new models. Does that, you see what I mean?
Yeah, but who's forcing it back? In other words, is there a particular voice then?
Yeah.
One of those chairs?
No, the public sphere, the public. Yeah. I mean, of course, it would be good to have some advocates at the table, right? In other words, you're not likely to have the developer, the banker, or whatever. They're not necessarily going to be the ones. Maybe they will, but to say this ought to come back. I mean, you can translate this. Think about healthcare and the way in which those debates have developed. The same cast of characters was around the various tables, and certain things even the public option went off the table because largely the interest of the set of interests, and I agree that it's a complex of interests. It's not just one linear thing that were there. So yes, theoretically, if there were different elected representatives or somebody with more clout or whatever it might be, then there might have been a different outcome. But I think what I'm really arguing here, and what I want to insist is our agency actually in this as architects as well as intellectuals is the capacity to structure the conversation, to put something on the table.
But
yeah.
It seems like your talk also showed the failure of that possibility,
the
failure of the public sphere as a space of discourse. If it didn't succeed in the new forms of Twitter and whatever, but also in the forms of, it seems like the laboratory of the museum experiment wasn't an entire success.
No,
and you tried so many different forms.
We did,
so what possibility is there for a conversation?
Here we are, right? What? Some work. Yeah, and I have to say that incrementally, one does see, somebody has something like this in the coffee. One does see, suddenly, I'm not taking any responsibility for this, but there are more studios addressing this. Barry and I definitely have intended this as a teaching tool to catalog. Maybe somebody here might do a studio. But anyway, I think, maybe you hear a little bit of frustration, but at the same time, insistence and persistence with the question. We're going to continue at the Yale Center to deal with aspects of this question, and it's not a surprise. It's more like a verification. Like now, we shouldn't be surprised at the limits.
I think it's a question of how do you change? How does what's thinkable and sayable actually get changed?
Yeah.
And I think what I took the premise of the exhibition was that the financial crisis was precisely that larger, not within architecture, but outside of architecture, larger event that would actually cause a change in what is thinkable and sayable. And that's how you structure the first part of your lecture, in terms of a larger conversation. And I think our own recognition, everyone's recognition, that it has to come from outside, that we can't just generate a recalibration of what is thinkable and sayable, just by the things that we propose and make.
Yeah, of course.
But the question is, it was interesting because you started out with a larger context of what's thinkable and sayable, and then you surprisingly, I didn't know your position on the exhibit itself, that turned it sort of back on the discipline.
Yes.
It said that even within the discipline, there is not a will to think or say something.
Exactly.
But, so I have a sort of question, which is there, to turn back to what I was saying earlier, is it possible for what we do actually, however potent or successful we may be, to actually change the terms of what's thinkable and sayable, or do we have to sit on the sidelines and wait for financial crisis, climate change, whatever, to come around and change the terms of what we can do?
Well, you'll notice that it didn't happen, and so, not just with this particular effort, but with the whole crisis. At this point, we're almost at the stage in which, as I said at the beginning, we're beginning to forget, or the public sphere is beginning to forget this. But no, I don't think one needs a crisis. Or to put it the other way around, it's still happening. This is absolutely critical. And I'll tell you the story about, because, these kinds of questions, we all struggle with these every day at a practical level as teachers, as participants in these processes in one way or the other. But it's, I think, often very helpful to contextualize and relativize our angst. So this is the Mumbai story, that we've been taking this thing a little bit freelancing, like on the road in a virtual form. There are over the last couple of years, there have been a series of digital, screen-based versions of this show that have been in a couple of places around the country, and there was one these are in these Studio X spaces that GSAP has in Beijing, and then in Mumbai. And for the one in Mumbai, we organized a workshop. It was called Housing Without Developers, because this is a city that's essentially run by developers. I mean, it's at the political level, and the corruption is rampant, and it's very, very direct and transparent. And of course, it's a city that is currently experiencing housing crisis, and has been for some time. And this kind of question never came up. It was a group of people, some of them activists, NGO folks, slum dwellers, the people who, organized. I mean, people who were organizing politically in the slums, and architects who had designed public housing, or social housing, it's called there. It just never came up because it's sort of like this is what you do. You don't wait for the crisis. This is what you do. I mean, this is what intellectuals do. We confront the conditions of our time, and maybe those conditions become more transparent. The crisis makes it so bloody obvious that you might allow you might allow yourself to think, oh well, finally maybe now something will happen, and then we wind up hope and change. Well, it turns out not so much. But this is I really do mean this. I mean, this is the work of the intellectual, and by intellectual I'm trying to define intellectual broadly to include professionals out there practicing and developing knowledge, practical knowledge, technical knowledge, in such ways as just, every moment, every time somebody pretends that affordable housing is the same as public housing, we say, no, it's not. I'm not idealizing what you oppose, what you would like to forget, but nor are we going to forget it. And so this is part of the teaching too, is the active process of reminding, remembering, reworking, thinking through, is also, I think, very much part of this thing.
Your experiment with some very public intellectuals didn't actually pan out very well.
Yeah, but as I said, I didn't, to be honest, I mean, would you have expected something dramatically different? And, there are a lot of other, under the circumstances. I mean, I wasn't surprised about it. I'm not even critical. I'm not critical at all, actually, of the work. I mean, I have personal opinions about this or that proposal, but that's not the point.
I think you are.
I'm critical.
You just made a case for a public intellectual.
Well, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
What intellectual work is that they didn't feel.
Well, yeah, but yeah. No, we've talked about that in the various public forums. But I can understand it. I mean, I do not think this is necessarily a heroic project where somebody gets up on a pedestal and announces a new paradigm. This is why I specifically said that we're not talking about new paradigms. I think it's as much a kind of positional activity. It's something you do every day in your job, and not just when you're voting or exercising the rights of citizenship and responsibilities. So hard to do. I know, and by no means. I mean, I'm the first one to plead guilty to failure. On all counts. But I think that also. That's sort of a larger point. That what seemed, if it was that easy, if it was as easy as organizing a museum exhibition, here's the new thing, here we go, guys, and then just doing it, well, maybe the stakes were not so high. And so this actually, I think, in that respect, at least had the positive effect, is what I meant by a turning point, of demonstrating the stakes. That's what I've been trying to articulate, in these kind of talks. There's like questions all over here. I don't know. Well, okay, how about two? Okay, you go since you started talking, then you look at the last word.
That's the way you usually come. I'm curious to know what you think are the tools that are important for producing an accurate imaginary. I think the utopia is an interesting framework to allow freedom to develop an idea that can try and chase our project and think about the way Corbusier chasing the idea of leisure to design some of his projects. And my thought is it disciplinary? Do we look at the fields of philosophy, politics, economics, help generate this architectural measuring is accurate, so that what we say and what we render can be physically built to generate the total qualities that you're talking about. And then there's like a second question anticipating this is, do we sift through the structure of loan applications, as an example, to then find some kind of granny?
I mean, I think probably you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. And I should qualify that if I didn't use the word utopia, but I know I've been associated with this and by design, intentionally so. But I certainly don't mean that as something that you reach for. As like a traditional idea of a project, you make an ideal city and you say, let's try to build it or incrementally work our way there. It's a reflexive concept, a dialectical one even if you like. In that sense, it's a very modest idea and at the same time a very, very ambitious idea. That has to do with systemic change, but also change as such. So in that sense, one working definition of utopia in the context I just described is the right to a toilet, which of course is not utopian, but it doesn't exist. I can assure you, you know very well, this does not exist universally. And it's part of the housing question. And so, that's what I'm saying. One could then ask concretely, okay, how does that occur? Under what conditions? What needs to change such that all, let's say, city dwellers, for example, have access to certain kinds of sanitation? And so there's a lot of very practical work that is done and needs to be done on this ground, but it's inframed by these kinds of problems, and I'm trying to sort of bring those to the foreground. So probably all the other examples that you listed would have elements of this in it. As I said before, to Albert's question, it's what you do every day at some level, and just so the way I construe my job or role here is discursive, is essentially discursive to operate at this level of the political, or we can call the architectural imaginary. And try to explain how that goes. That's just one of the tools, though. You say it's not the master tool. All these other ones are tools, too. Does that satisfactorily answer? We don't same things.
It's the accuracy question.
The accuracy question. Accuracy of what?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean like being able to build a perfect city?
No. Just that if you make a claim about how something can work, or they achieves it, that somehow you've rooted in something unpredictable.
No, I understand that thinking that in a way means ends, instrumental thinking is not really it's part of how we operate in our field. This will do that. This will work. This will, but that's not what I'm after. Really, is some set of specifications. And then a way to achieve that set of specifications. That is actually how most utopias, traditional utopias work. That, if you read like science fiction, for example, you'll utopian science fiction, you usually get a long list of the rules of the constitution of that particular society. And this is Thomas More's utopia that, is like this. And exactly kind of incredibly realist detail of how it's all going to work, right? So that your question will be satisfied. But what's actually happening in that moment is a cut, is a differentiation between one world and another world, and that's really all we need. A here and a there, a this and a that. That's the dialectical structure, and the specifications are, in a sense, a distraction rather than the name of the game. Anyway, I think we have one more question. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Your discussion with Albert about the
Yeah.
I'm wondering, in a developer-driven market, how realistic it is to predict that a beautiful intellectual housing project is going to become.
Yes, yes, that's right. But that's the point. The word realistic is the key point. That's the table. That's what is considered to be possible under current conditions is what needs to be changed. And you're completely right. That is totally unrealistic. even naive to imagine, I mean, never mind beautiful, but that it exists, that the thing would exist, even as some new urbanist fantasy, is actually off the table. So, and again, not as solution, but as in a sense, you can think about it this way. What kind of a conversation, like let's take any housing project that any of you could design, right? And just put it on a table and then attribute to it those characteristics. They just say this is a piece of public housing. Immediately you would get to the question that you just asked. How could it be? I mean, nobody's going to pay for it. Who's going to do it? The developers are going to. Then you could also ask, well, what needs to change in order for this to be possible? For that simple, translation to be made. What other changes need to be made? This is the technical thing. Well, taxes, for example. Oh, are we allowed to talk about that? Well, typological questions are also important, right? Mixed use, etc. There are all kinds of things that inputs and outputs and inputs and out feedback loops of all kinds that go into that discussion, of which, all of which are at some level architecturally specific. I do insist on that. And as I was saying to the at the coffee, one of the reasons, one small, I think a success of the show, if I can claim such a thing, was the getting big models in a museum at MoMA, because actually you could simply ask of that, and architecture is pretty good at that when it's in a model form that's of a certain scale. Somebody could look at it, anybody, and say, not just I'd like to live there, but how does it work? Under what conditions would this be possible? And then, my larger point here has been that in most cases the hardest thing to change is the script. Basically that's what you're describing, the script that allows this to be intelligible in this particular way. As a possibility, not as a solution, but as a possibility, as a set of values, as a frame of mind, even.
Would you say the Socratic method is kind of your attempt at trying to shape a leading question or a sort of dialogue,
sure.
a manner of dialogue that would allow people to open certain things and be closed?
Yeah, there are certain passages. I mean,
I mean, that's definitely what Socrates does.
He's
trying to lead.
Yeah, and poor Glaucon is sort of the victim of the whole thing, and probably in the way that
he keeps being surprised by it.
Of course. I mean, you all could be the judge of whether you think that's interesting or successful or whatever, but
that's a pedagogical doctrine.
It's very much, that's also partly my answer to Albert, that quite a lot, because this is what I do for a living, and many of us do so, is teach, and this is a pedagogical exercise. In the narrow sense of maybe some of you would like to do it as a studio, or in the broader sense of, asking those kinds of hypothetical questions in a quasi-Socratic manner at least, such that one could not arrive at the perfect city as Socrates and Glaucon do, but such as one can remain stuck in traffic actually, and continue to contemplate the possibilities and test them.
So this does continue tomorrow at lunch. There's lunch here, roundtable discussion that will be set off by a response by Sarah Stevens to Reinhold's talk, and then an open forum for discussion provided, fueled by either pizza or tacos. You have to show up and figure out which one it's going to be. So thank you very much.